The price of silence and why it pays better than truth. They say truth is priceless, but that's not true, is it? In today's world, truth has a very clear price tag, and more disturbingly, so does silence. One is costly, messy, dangerous. The other is profitable, clean, and highly preferred by those in power. We live in an era where silence isn't just compliance, it's currency, where keeping quiet has been industrialized, monetized, and turned into a multi-billion-dollar machine. Let's be clear, we're not just talking about people choosing not to speak. We're talking about a systemic marketplace where truth is negotiated, fear is weaponized, and silence is bought and sold like stock. So the real question isn't, why don't people speak up? It's, who benefits when they don't? A world built on whispered deals. Behind every scandal you've heard about, there are 10 you never will. Because in nearly every corner of power, be it politics, entertainment, finance, or tech, there exists a quiet transaction, a payout in exchange for silence, a promotion in exchange for looking the other way, a contract clause that binds the truth behind legal walls, a warning whispered by a boss. It's better for your future if you just drop it. These aren't exceptions, they're architecture. They are the foundation of the silence economy, a shadow market built on secrecy, maintained by fear, and protected by law. Why silence pays more. Think about it. When someone speaks the truth, especially a dangerous or inconvenient one, what happens? They make enemies, they lose alliances, they risk jobs, safety, reputation. They get sued, smeared, shut out. But when someone stays quiet, they keep their paycheck, they get promoted, they're praised for being loyal or professional, they're rewarded, sometimes directly, often subtly. And so silence becomes not just the easier path, but the more profitable one. In this twisted economy, it's not the truth that pays, it's your ability to bury it. Truth as a liability. Truth, ironically, has become the most dangerous thing you can carry in certain environments. It threatens brands, it exposes fraud, it reveals abuse, it challenges systems that were never meant to be questioned. Which is why entire industries have emerged not to defend truth, but to contain it. Reputation management firms, crisis communication agencies, corporate HR departments trained not to protect people, but to protect the company. Legal teams that draft airtight non-disclosure agreements as standard onboarding practice. They exist not to spread truth, but to minimize damage, not to seek justice, but to maintain silence. The real cost of speaking out. Imagine this. You're an employee at a powerful company. You discover something illegal, unethical, or dangerous. You have two options. Option 1, speak out. You might go viral. You might be hailed as brave. But then what? You're fired, blacklisted, sued, called unstable or bitter. Your family receives threats. You spend your savings on legal defense. You're alone. Option 2, stay quiet. You keep your job. You get a bonus. You're invited to the next company retreat. You sleep uneasily, but you sleep in your own bed. Now ask yourself honestly, which one would most people choose? This isn't about cowardice. It's about survival in a system where telling the truth costs everything and keeping silence costs nothing. Or worse, where silence is rewarded. How the system was built. Silence isn't an accident, it's a strategy. From the boardrooms of billion-dollar companies to the quiet hallways of government agencies, there is a silent agreement. We'll keep paying you as long as you don't tell them what you know. And so the silence economy thrives. It's built on 5 pillars: fear, fear of job loss, reputation damage, isolation; shame, internalized guilt, doubt, gaslighting; legal traps, non-disclosure agreements, gag orders, settlements, financial incentives, promotions, bonuses, golden handshakes, social conditioning. Be a team player. Don't rock the boat. It's not your place. These pillars don't just discourage truth, they punish it. And in doing so, they ensure that truth becomes the rarest, most risky, and least profitable commodity in our modern world. Silence as a business model. Look closer at your favorite brands, your tech platforms, your media outlets, your workplace. Behind their public image lies an internal policy. Silence the leak, control the narrative, protect the brand. This isn't paranoia, it's business. A company facing sexual harassment allegations doesn't seek justice, they offer settlements. A government exposed in a scandal doesn't apologize, they bury the story under something louder. A public figure caught in controversy doesn't admit fault, they hire public relations teams to shift attention. Because truth is messy, silence is manageable. And managing silence, that's a billion-dollar industry. The human cost. But while silence pays the system, it drains the soul. The employee who saw injustice but stayed quiet. The journalist who buried a lead under pressure. The activist who was warned to stay in their lane. The victim who was told it would ruin their life to speak out. They carry the weight of silence like a shadow. It follows them into sleep. It eats at their sense of self. It leaves them wondering, what would have happened if I had spoken up? But here's the truth they can't suppress. Some people still speak, and when they do, it cracks the foundation. It disrupts the narrative. It reminds the world that truth still exists, even when it's expensive, inconvenient, or dangerous. Because every silence that's broken, every secret that escapes, every voice that rises is a rebellion against the economy of fear. And while silence may pay more, truth is still the only thing that can set us free. NDAs, hush money, and the legal gag machine. There's a phrase you hear often in legal circles. This never happened. And if it did, you're not allowed to talk about it. That's the quiet power of a non-disclosure agreement, or NDA. It sounds harmless, maybe even professional, just a routine document, part of business. But NDAs are more than legal tools. They are muzzles. They are walls built around the truth. And today, they are one of the most powerful weapons in the silence economy. Because when the truth is dangerous, you don't need to destroy it. You only need to bind it in legal chains. The invention of the legal gag. Once upon a time, contracts were about protection of property, of trade secrets, of innovation. But over time, corporations discovered something far more valuable than intellectual property. They discovered that the real threat wasn't someone stealing your product, it was someone telling your secrets. That's when the NDA evolved. No longer just about business confidentiality, it became a shield against exposure. It became a way to bury stories, a way to neutralize people, victims, whistleblowers, employees, contractors, journalists, anyone who knew something they weren't supposed to say and had the courage to say it. The hush money pipeline. But legal documents alone aren't always enough. Sometimes the truth needs a sweeter cage. That's where hush money comes in. You've seen it before. A celebrity is accused of misconduct. Suddenly, the accuser withdraws the claim. A statement is released. We have reached a mutual agreement. No admission of guilt, no trial, no details, just silence, bought in full. These settlements are carefully structured. You'll receive compensation, but in return, you'll never speak of this again. Not to your family, not to the press, not to anyone. If you break the deal, you'll be sued. You'll lose everything. Your silence isn't a choice, it's a contract, and the penalty for breaking it is destruction. This isn't fiction, it's industry practice. Entire legal departments are dedicated to crafting airtight gag orders. Entire budgets are reserved for settlement funds. Some corporations even call it the cost of doing business. It's cheaper to silence one person than to face the truth publicly. What you don't know can't hurt them. You might wonder, why would someone take the money? Why would anyone sign such a contract? But ask yourself this: if you were a single parent struggling to pay bills, and someone offered you a year's salary to keep quiet, what would you do? If you had already been threatened, discredited, and left alone, would you still fight? These agreements prey on desperation. They exploit fear. They capitalize on fatigue. By the time someone signs an NDA or accepts hush money, they've usually already lost so much: dignity, energy, support. The contract becomes not a victory, but a surrender, a way out of a war they never wanted to fight. And most importantly, it ensures that no one else hears their story. The pattern repeats. This system doesn't just suppress one voice, it creates a pattern. One person stays quiet, so the next person assumes they're alone, and the next, and the next. It creates the illusion that nothing ever happened, that no one ever complained, that the system works. When in truth, the silence is manufactured, it's enforced, it's purchased. This is not justice, this is erasure. And it happens in every field. In the tech world, where innovation hides behind abuse. In the healthcare system, where malpractice is silenced by settlements. In the entertainment industry, where stars are protected and victims are paid to vanish. In government, where national interest becomes a cover for personal corruption. NDAs have become the concrete in the wall of silence. The NDA gag machine. Let's call it what it is: a machine. One that processes every threat to a reputation, a brand, a campaign, and outputs one result: silence. It has gears made of lawyers, pistons made of money, a control panel built from fear. This machine doesn't sleep. It doesn't care about right or wrong. It only cares about outcome. And if the truth is inconvenient, it will be removed, redacted, and sealed forever. But the damage doesn't end with one agreement. NDAs aren't just documents, they are signals. To other employees, don't speak. To the media, there's nothing to see. To the public, everything is fine. And so the silence spreads, not just legally, but psychologically. The fear becomes contagious. The price of honesty becomes too high. The truth becomes a liability again. The illusion of choice. Some will argue no one forced them to sign. It was voluntary. It was their decision. But choice in a system designed to punish you for speaking is not real choice. When the options are poverty or silence, shame or secrecy, exile or agreement, the decision is not freedom, it is survival. That is not justice, that is coercion dressed as consent. The truth never gets its day in the sun. The worst part is this. Once silence is bought, the truth never gets its day in the sun. There's no investigation, no public reckoning, no change. The same harm happens again. New victims are created. New payouts are arranged. New NDAs are signed. And the machine keeps running. Silence becomes tradition. Secrecy becomes culture. Accountability becomes impossible. The silence becomes more dangerous than the truth ever was. And we wonder why nothing changes. There is no accountability without voice. There is no justice without noise. There is no truth without someone willing to speak it. Even when it costs them everything. Even when the machine is waiting. Because every system that survives on silence only fears one thing: someone breaking it. Cancel culture, the invisible threat that keeps you quiet. They don't have to put a hand over your mouth anymore. Now they just let the internet do it for them. In the past, silence was enforced with chains, with threats, with exile. Today, it's enforced with algorithms, hashtags, and public outrage. They call it cancel culture, but what it really is a psychological weapon, a warning shot, a message to anyone who dares speak outside the line. Be careful what you say, or you'll be next. The myth of the mob. We've been told that cancel culture is just the will of the people, that it's the collective power of the public holding others accountable, that it's democratic. But look deeper. The outrage is rarely organic. It's curated, amplified, sometimes even triggered intentionally. Who benefits when someone is canceled? Ask that question, and the myth starts to crack. Sometimes it's corporations distancing themselves from liability. Sometimes it's politicians distracting from deeper scandals. Sometimes it's media outlets chasing clicks and controversy. Cancel culture is not just punishment, it's performance. A spectacle that says, "We've done our job, the threat is neutralized." But behind the scenes, the real goal is much simpler: silence. The chilling effect. Cancel culture doesn't just target the loudest voices, it silences the quiet ones too. You see someone lose their job over a tweet, someone dragged through headlines over a comment, someone publicly shamed for an opinion, even if they apologized. And you learn the lesson. Don't speak. Don't ask hard questions. Don't share unpopular truths. This is what psychologists call a chilling effect. It's not about censorship from the top. It's about self-censorship from within. You start erasing your own thoughts before they leave your mouth, not because you're wrong, but because you're afraid. Afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of being labeled, afraid of being destroyed. The illusion of justice. Cancel culture claims to seek justice, to hold people accountable, to protect the marginalized, to amplify the unheard. And sometimes it does. But just as often, it's used as a tool of convenience, not for justice, but for control. Someone reveals corporate abuse, dig up their past, and cancel them. A whistleblower challenges a government agency, call them problematic. An artist speaks a controversial truth, accuse them of insensitivity. The message is clear. It doesn't matter how right you are. If you make us uncomfortable, we'll ruin you. Not with facts, not with debate, but with shame, isolation, and noise. So the next time someone wants to speak up, they won't just ask, "Is this true?" They'll ask, "Is it worth the price?" The real currency. Cancel culture doesn't destroy everyone equally. The powerful often survive it. They issue an apology, hire a PR team, take a short break, then return. But for the ordinary person, the employee, the student, the activist, cancellation is permanent exile. No job, no reputation, no way back. And so, silence becomes the safer currency, the smarter investment, the only path to survival. When you realize that speaking up might mean losing everything, you begin to hoard your voice like a secret. You begin to speak only what is safe, approved, palatable, and the system wins again. An economy built on fear. What cancel culture creates is not accountability, it is anxiety. An environment where everyone watches what they say, not because it's wrong, but because it's risky. Where truth becomes dangerous, where questions become suspect, where disagreement becomes violence. This is not empowerment. This is emotional surveillance. You don't need police when your own friends, your followers, your coworkers are the enforcers. You don't need a cage when shame is more effective than walls. And you don't need to censor anyone when you've already made them afraid to speak. When silence becomes safety. In this world, silence is not weakness, it's strategy. It's how people keep their jobs, keep their social circles, keep their dignity intact. They see the damage done to others and think, "I won't make that mistake." They choose invisibility over impact, safety over truth. And so they vanish. Their ideas disappear. Their stories go untold. Their wisdom remains locked away, not because it wasn't valuable, but because it wasn't allowed. The long-term cost. Here's the tragedy. Cancel culture doesn't just silence the bad, it also silences the brave, the creative, the different, the dissenting. It creates a generation afraid to experiment, afraid to fail publicly, afraid to think out loud. Because one mistake, one unpopular opinion, one misunderstood sentence, and you're done. But without honest voices, society doesn't grow, it doesn't evolve, it doesn't heal. We become an echo chamber of safe statements, a culture addicted to outrage, allergic to nuance. And in the end, we don't just lose people, we lose progress. The invisible prison. This is the quiet power of cancel culture. It doesn't need a courtroom. It doesn't need a firing squad. All it needs is your fear, your silence, your submission. It whispers, "Don't speak, don't ask, don't challenge." And you obey, not because you agree, but because you're tired, because you're scared, because you don't want to be next. But what happens when everyone thinks that way? When every truth teller stays quiet? When every rebel plays it safe? When every uncomfortable idea dies before it's born? You get a society that's polite on the surface and dying underneath. The courage to be unliked. But there is a way out. It starts with a decision. To value truth over approval, to risk being misunderstood, to speak even when your voice shakes. Not every opinion is worth defending. Not every mistake deserves a platform. But some truths are too important to let fear win. And every time someone speaks them, they break the machine just a little more. They remind us that courage is louder than cancellation, that truth, no matter how controversial, deserves air, that silence may keep you safe, but only truth will keep you free. Whistleblowers and the price of truth. There's a moment, quiet, lonely, heavy. It's the moment someone discovers a truth that should not be hidden, but everyone around them wants it to be. That moment marks the beginning of a different kind of journey, not toward glory, but toward isolation, toward loss, toward war. They're called whistleblowers, but the name doesn't capture the cost, because what they really are people who stood at the edge of comfort and chose to jump into the fire for the sake of the truth. The moment it all changes. Most whistleblowers don't set out to be heroes. They're not rebels, not troublemakers, not seeking fame. They're employees, doctors, engineers, analysts, people who once believed in the system they served, until one day they see something. Fraud, abuse, negligence, corruption, and suddenly they are faced with a choice. Do I ignore this? Do I pretend I didn't see it? Do I protect my job and my future? Or do I say something, knowing full well it might destroy my life? This choice is where courage begins and consequences follow. The system turns. When someone chooses to speak up, something strange happens. The system they were once part of turns on them. They're no longer a respected employee. They're a liability, an enemy, a problem that must be contained. Their emails are monitored. Their performance is questioned. Their mental health is suddenly under review. Rumors begin to spread. Support disappears. And eventually, they're gone. Fired, pushed out, blacklisted. But the punishment doesn't end at the job. Whistleblowers often lose everything: careers, relationships, savings, reputation. Some are sued, others are threatened. Many fall into depression. Some are never heard from again. This is the real cost of truth. The myth of protection. You might think, but aren't whistleblowers protected by law? Yes, in theory. Many countries have whistleblower protection acts, hotlines, legal frameworks. But in practice, these protections often fail. Why? Because the laws are weak, or filled with loopholes, or only apply to specific situations, or are ignored entirely by powerful institutions. And even when a whistleblower wins in court, it's often after years of legal battles, financial ruin, and emotional devastation. Justice delayed, justice denied. The world only sees the verdict, not the sleepless nights, the fear, the isolation, the loss of identity. They told the truth and paid for it with their lives, not always literally, but piece by piece. The few who made it. There are names we know: Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Frances Haugen, Daniel Ellsberg, Erin Brockovich. They exposed surveillance, war crimes, big tech manipulation, toxic cover-ups. They changed the world, but not without consequences. Some had to flee their countries. Others were imprisoned. Many lived in hiding for years. All of them were attacked, discredited, vilified. Because in the silent economy, the one thing more dangerous than a lie is the person who dares to tell the truth. And even when whistleblowers are proven right, the damage is already done. To their name, to their peace, to their future. That's the message the system sends. Speak up, and you'll never work again. The everyday whistleblower. But most whistleblowers aren't famous. They're the nurse who reported unsafe conditions, the factory worker who warned about faulty parts, the intern who saw financial fraud, the teacher who refused to change grades, the nonprofit worker who discovered donor money being misused. They spoke up and then quietly disappeared. No headlines, no documentaries, no awards, just silence. And sometimes regret, because the truth didn't set them free, it buried them. But would they do it again? Many say yes, not because it was easy, not because it ended well, but because they couldn't live with themselves if they hadn't. That is the unbearable weight of truth. When staying silent feels like complicity, and speaking out feels like suicide, but you do it anyway, because conscience is louder than consequence. Why the system fears them? Whistleblowers are dangerous, not because they lie, but because they prove that truth exists, and that silence is a choice. They remind others that it's possible to break the machine, to say no, to shine a light. And that is exactly why the system must punish them. Not just to silence them, but to make an example of them, to warn the others, to keep the next truth buried, to protect the illusion of control. Because if one person stands up, others might too. The silent ones we lost. There are whistleblowers who never made it. Some took their own lives. Others died mysteriously. Some disappeared from the records, from history, from memory. And the injustices they tried to expose continued, profited, expanded. This is the deepest tragedy. When the truth is spoken, but no one listens. Or worse, when the system ensures that no one ever hears it. The courage to continue. But still, people speak, even knowing the cost, even seeing what happened to the ones before them, because truth is a stubborn thing. It demands light. It haunts the conscience. It refuses to be buried forever. And for some people, the pain of silence is greater than the pain of sacrifice. So they speak. They speak knowing they might be destroyed, knowing the system will deny, deflect, discredit, knowing they may never be the same, but also knowing that without people like them, nothing would ever change. The call to us. We live in a world where the silent economy is thriving, where truth is rare, where whistleblowers are punished, not praised. But every time someone speaks, it weakens the machine. Every truth revealed is a crack in the wall. Every voice that breaks through the fear gives permission to others. So maybe the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones who hold power. Maybe they're the ones who refuse to be quiet. And maybe that's exactly who we're meant to be. Media conglomerates and controlled narratives. They don't need to silence you with force when they can drown you in noise. They don't need to hide the truth when they can flood the world with distraction. And they don't need to lie when they control which version of the truth gets told. This is the quiet power of media in the silence economy. not to inform, not to reveal, but to manage the narrative and keep the illusion of freedom intact. The myth of a free press. We are taught that media is the fourth pillar of democracy, that it exists to hold power accountable, to speak truth to corruption, to protect the public from manipulation. But ask yourself, when was the last time the media truly challenged power, not just performatively, but structurally? The reality is this: media is not independent. It is owned by corporations, by billionaires, by interests that benefit more from silence than truth. And when your paycheck comes from the very system you're supposed to question, how loud can your voice really be? The business of narratives. Media today is not just about facts, it's about framing. Two people can look at the same event and walk away with two completely different understandings depending on how the story was told. Which facts were included? Which were left out? What words were used? What images were chosen? What questions were never asked? This is not accidental. This is architecture. Newsrooms today don't just report the news, they manage perception. And perception is everything, especially when it protects power and profits. The cost of telling the wrong story. Journalists who cross the line, who dig too deep, ask the wrong questions, or challenge sacred narratives, often face quiet consequences. They are reassigned, blacklisted, silenced, or simply fired. Not always dramatically, sometimes subtly. A phone call, an editor's cold silence, a budget that disappears, a project that never airs. Behind the scenes, the message is clear. You can tell the story as long as it's the right version. The illusion of choice. You think you're getting a wide range of perspectives, different channels, different logos, different anchors. But look closer. 6 corporations own 90% of the media in the modern world. That's not diversity. That's consolidation. You're not seeing different views. You're seeing different flavors of the same product. And in that system, true dissent, true investigation, true disruption is almost impossible. Because the role of corporate media is not to uncover the truth, but to control its exposure. Controlled outrage. Have you ever noticed how some scandals explode across every screen while others disappear without a trace? It's not about importance, it's about permission. If a story threatens power, if it exposes systemic failure, if it challenges the narrative being sold to the public, it is quietly removed or never reported in the first place. But if a story distracts, divides, or sells fear, it is broadcast everywhere, on repeat, until we're numb. This is not journalism. This is programming. And every day we are being programmed to feel informed while staying blind. The comfort of distraction. The silence economy doesn't always silence with censorship. Sometimes it silences with entertainment. Streaming, celebrity drama, scandal cycles, clickbait, tragedy on loop, endless commentary about things that don't change our lives, while the things that do remain untouched. The machine doesn't care if you're informed. It cares if you're manageable. And the easiest way to manage a population is to keep them distracted enough to never ask the real questions. When silence looks like information. We scroll for hours, we consume headlines, we feel outraged, exhausted, overwhelmed. But do we really know more? Or just feel like we do? This is the genius of narrative control. You don't need to lie, you just need to curate. Highlight certain truths, ignore others. Shape perception without ever saying anything false. And suddenly, millions believe they have the full picture, when all they've been given is a carefully cropped corner of the frame. The stories never told. There are truths so dangerous, they never make it to air. Stories of corruption in high places, whistleblowers who were never interviewed, cover-ups buried under legal pressure, survivors who were silenced by threat, shame, or money. And these stories never get told, not because they aren't important, but because they are. Because if people knew, if they truly knew, the machine might break. So instead, we are kept just informed enough to feel safe, but never informed enough to feel empowered. The journalists who still fight. And yet, in the cracks of this system, some still resist. Independent reporters, investigative journalists, truth-tellers who walk away from mainstream platforms to speak freely, often at great cost. They are attacked, labeled, smeared, demonetized, erased. But they continue because they know that silence, especially in the face of power, is a form of betrayal, and that narrative control is the most dangerous censorship of all. What we can do. We must learn to see the silence, to notice not just what's being said, but what's being left out, to ask who benefits from this version of the truth, who is not being heard, whose story was never told. Because once we see the strings, we can stop being puppets. And once we stop accepting silence, we begin demanding something deeper. Truth. Not convenience, not comfort, not consensus, but truth in all its discomfort, complexity, and power. That is how we break the silence economy, not by yelling louder, but by listening harder. The reputation industry. How truth gets buried in PR. When the truth threatens power, they don't always deny it. They just bury it beneath something more palatable. In the silence economy, not everything is silenced with fear or force. Sometimes the most effective weapon is distraction, wrapped in polish. That's the job of the reputation industry. It doesn't destroy the truth. It simply drowns it beneath a flood of spin, story, and strategic narrative. The illusion of authenticity. We live in a world obsessed with image, where perception is currency and brand is everything. And so entire industries have emerged, not to reveal the truth, but to manage how the truth is seen. Public relations, crisis communication, reputation management. These aren't just departments, they're frontline defenses, not against lies, but against inconvenient reality. When something goes wrong, a company, a celebrity, a politician doesn't say, "What really happened?" They ask, "What will people think happened?" And then they craft the answer accordingly. The power of the reframe. A scandal becomes a misunderstanding. Abuse becomes poor judgment. Fraud becomes a clerical error. Negligence becomes a one-time lapse. And behind every carefully worded apology, every rebranding campaign, every sympathetic interview is a team of professionals working not to fix the issue, but to reshape the story. Because if you can't erase the past, you can rewrite the narrative. And once the public has a softer version of the truth, The real damage is neutralized. Controlling the search results. But PR isn't just about press conferences anymore. It's about algorithms. Type someone's name into a search engine, and what do you see? Chances are you'll find what their reputation team wants you to find. Positive articles, strategic content, glossy interviews, keyword-stuffed blog posts, floods of content designed to bury negative stories under layers of digital noise. This is called suppression SEO, and it's big business. It doesn't delete the truth. It just pushes it to page 5, where most people never look. That's how reputation is manufactured in the digital age, not through honesty, but through engineering. Reputation laundering. We hear a lot about money laundering, but few people talk about reputation laundering. It happens when people or organizations engage in image makeovers after doing something questionable. A CEO donates to charity after exploiting workers. A politician visits a disaster zone after cutting funds to emergency services. A tech giant launches a new sustainability campaign after polluting communities for years. It's not about change, it's about optics. And when the public buys it, the system breathes easier, because the truth may still exist, but it no longer matters. The price of silence is included. What most people don't realize is that PR often starts long before the crisis. Reputation firms are hired preemptively. They prepare statements in advance. They monitor potential leaks. They study social sentiment. They build positive press portfolios just in case something goes wrong. And when it does, the plan is already in motion. Influencers are briefed. Allies are activated. Media contacts are alerted. Narratives are seeded. By the time the public hears about the issue, the damage control is already underway. Truth becomes background noise beneath the sound of polished messaging. Case studies we forget. There are stories that briefly made headlines, only to vanish days later. Major frauds, cover-ups, mishandled disasters, abuses of power. Why do they fade so quickly? Not because they were resolved, but because they were reframed. A few well-timed news cycles, a new scandal elsewhere, a coordinated shift in public attention. And suddenly, what should have led to accountability leads to nothing. The silence wasn't forced, it was managed. The human cost. But behind every buried scandal is a human story that never got told properly. The employee who was silenced, the victim who never saw justice, the community that paid the price. Their pain becomes a footnote, while the perpetrator walks away with a new image and a cleaner Google search. This is the cruelty of the reputation industry. It doesn't just reshape perception, it erases suffering. And in doing so, it tells the world one thing. If you have enough money, you don't need to be innocent. You just need a better story. The truth never stood a chance. Once upon a time, a scandal might have brought down the powerful. Today, it's just another campaign to manage. Because in the silence economy, truth is not the enemy. Uncontrolled truth is. And so, we are fed narratives crafted to make us feel like justice is being served, while nothing really changes. We confuse messaging with accountability. image with integrity, and silence with resolution. What can be done? If we want to break this machine, we have to stop rewarding image over action. We must look deeper than headlines, question curated content, follow the money behind the message, listen to those without a PR team. And most importantly, we must remember that a polished apology does not erase the truth. Real change requires real confrontation with the messy, uncomfortable, inconvenient facts. And that starts by refusing to let reputation replace reality. Because as long as we let perception win, the truth will always lose. Corporate silence, HR, lawsuits, and internal gags. Not all silence is external. Sometimes the quietest places are inside the walls of an office. Inside companies, silence isn't just expected, it's engineered, institutionalized, normalized. You're told it's professionalism. You're told it's loyalty. You're told it's just how things are. But beneath the company slogans and HR handbooks and team building retreats is a different kind of culture, one where speaking up comes with a cost, and silence is rewarded more than truth. The unwritten rules. Most companies won't say it outright, but everyone knows the rules. Don't criticize your manager. Don't question decisions from the top. Don't talk about salary. Don't bring up harassment. Don't report safety issues too loudly. Don't challenge the status quo. Play nice, keep quiet, stay employed. These rules are rarely in writing, but they are enforced with precision. The moment you speak out, you become a threat to the image, the brand, the hierarchy. And the system is built to deal with threats quickly and quietly. HR is not your friend. When something goes wrong in the workplace, we're told to go to human resources, to report the problem, to trust the process. But here's what most people learn the hard way. HR doesn't work for you. It works for the company. Its job is to protect the business, not the individual, to manage risk, not seek justice. So when you report discrimination or harassment or abuse, the process is not designed to resolve the problem. It's designed to contain it, to gather information, to assess legal liability, to decide what action, if any, will best protect the company's image. And if that means silencing you or quietly pushing you out, that's exactly what happens. Performance reviews become negative. Projects are reassigned. Your voice becomes an inconvenience. And before long, you're gone. Not because you were wrong, but because you were honest. The legal trap. In many companies, silence is not just encouraged, it's required. Non-disparagement clauses, mandatory arbitration, confidentiality agreements. You sign them during onboarding, not realizing you're giving up your right to speak freely. And if you ever witness something illegal or unethical and try to take action, you discover you're already trapped. You can't sue publicly. You can't talk to the press. You can't warn others. If you do, you risk financial ruin. This is how internal silence is maintained, not with fear alone, but with legal strategy. A culture of quiet. The most disturbing part is how quickly this becomes normal. People stop raising concerns. They stop asking questions. They laugh off toxic behavior. They advise each other, just keep your head down. Don't get involved. It's not worth it. And little by little, the truth disappears from the workplace. Not because no one sees the problems, but because no one feels safe to speak. What starts as self-protection becomes self-erasure, and the silence spreads. The price of being difficult. There's a label used in corporate culture to discredit the truth teller. Difficult. Not a team player. Too sensitive. Not aligned with company values. Unprofessional. These are the words used to turn a whistleblower into a problem. And once that label sticks, everything they say is dismissed. It's not what they said, it's who they are now perceived to be. And the real issue, the abuse, the fraud, the risk, is buried beneath the company's favorite phrase. We handled it internally. Internal gags and golden exits. Sometimes the person speaking up is too senior to fire immediately, too visible, too experienced. In those cases, the solution is simple. Buy their silence. A severance agreement, a generous exit package, a clause that ensures they never speak publicly again. It's a clean break. No mess, no headlines. Just another internal matter resolved with money and legal paperwork. This is not accountability. This is erasure with benefits. When silence becomes culture. Over time, companies become places where truth doesn't just go unheard, it becomes unwelcome. Employees learn to hide problems, to protect their image, to protect their paycheck. Leaders surround themselves with yes men. Dissent disappears, and decisions are made in a vacuum of false consensus. And then, something catastrophic happens. A lawsuit, a scandal, a crisis. And everyone asks, how did no one say anything? The answer is simple. They did. But the company was built to ignore them. The people who tried to warn them are long gone, silenced, discarded, forgotten. Breaking the internal silence. It doesn't have to be this way. Some organizations are beginning to understand that real growth requires real honesty, that safety and innovation are born from cultures where people are free to speak. But change only comes when the silence is named, when the structures that punish truth are dismantled. It takes leaders with humility, policies with teeth, and people, ordinary people, who refuse to keep quiet just to stay comfortable. Because in the silence economy, the most radical thing you can do at work is tell the truth. Not loudly, not rebelliously, just consistently. Until silence is no longer the default, and truth becomes part of the culture again.
The psychology of staying silent. Fear, loss, and learned helplessness. Not all silence is forced from the outside. Some silence grows from the inside, slowly, quietly, until it becomes a second skin. People don't always stay silent because they're told to. Often they stay silent because they've learned it's safer that way. This is the hidden layer of the silence economy. Not legal threats, not corporate policies, not media manipulation, but human psychology. The way fear reshapes the brain. The way repeated failure trains you to stop trying. The way society convinces you that your voice doesn't matter. This is the silence that no one sees, but almost everyone carries. The first silence. It usually starts small. A child speaks up about something wrong and is told, "Stop making a scene. Don't be dramatic. Keep this in the family." A student questions a teacher and is humiliated. A worker points out a mistake and is ignored. A friend shares a painful truth and is laughed at. The message is subtle but powerful. Speaking brings pain. Honesty brings isolation. It's better to stay quiet. And so they do. The fear of consequences. As we grow older, the consequences of truth become heavier. Speak up and you might lose your job, your friends, your community, your reputation, your safety. And not just because of what you say, but how others might twist it, weaponize it, use it against you. Fear is a powerful teacher, and in a world where punishment is real, fear creates obedience. Not the kind enforced by handcuffs, but by hesitation. By the voice in your head that whispers, "Don't say that, don't ask that, it's not worth it." Until eventually, you stop even thinking about speaking. Because the silence has moved inside you. The pain of not being heard. One of the deepest human needs is to be heard. But when you've spoken up in the past and no one listened, when you've shared your truth and it was dismissed, when you've cried out for help and were met with silence, you start to believe that your voice has no value. This is where silence turns into despair. Why speak if no one cares? Why fight if nothing changes? This is not cowardice. This is trauma. This is emotional fatigue. And for many, this is where the silence becomes permanent. Learned helplessness. In psychology, there's a term called learned helplessness. It happens when someone is repeatedly exposed to painful or negative experiences and comes to believe that no matter what they do, they cannot change the outcome. So they stop trying, stop resisting, stop speaking. Even when escape is possible, even when help is near, they remain still because the past has taught them that nothing will ever improve. This is one of the most tragic parts of the silence economy. Not that people are silenced by force, but that they have been trained to silence themselves, because hope has been slowly stripped away. The role of shame. Silence isn't always about fear. Sometimes it's about shame. People stay quiet not just because they're afraid, but because they feel unworthy. They think, maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I deserved it. This is especially true for victims of abuse, injustice, and betrayal. When society teaches you to blame yourself for what happened, silence becomes an act of survival. It protects you from judgment, from disbelief, from reliving the pain. But it also keeps the wound open, invisible, and unresolved. Silence as identity. Over time, silence stops being a reaction and becomes an identity. You become the quiet one, the person who keeps peace, the one who never causes trouble. You wear silence like a badge of maturity, of strength, of wisdom. But inside, there is tension, a truth that never leaves, a story that was never told, a scream that never got the chance to rise. And you wonder if your silence has made you wise or just invisible. The system depends on your silence. What's most disturbing is that the system knows all of this. It knows that fear works, that shame works, that isolation works. It doesn't need to silence everyone. It just needs you to believe that speaking won't change anything. Because once that belief takes hold, you become your own warden, your own censor, your own prison. The cell door is open, but you never walk out, because the silence feels safer than the unknown, the truth about your voice. But here's what the silence economy never wants you to realize. Your voice, even if it trembles, even if it breaks, has power. Maybe not the kind that changes the world overnight, maybe not the kind that gets headlines or applause, but the kind that breaks cycles, that challenges lies, that reminds others they're not alone. Because every time someone speaks, they light a fire. A small one, maybe just a spark, but fire spreads, and silence cannot survive fire. The courage to speak anyway. There will always be fear. There will always be risk. There will always be people who want you to stay quiet. But there will also be people who need to hear your truth. People who are waiting for permission, for proof that it's possible, for someone to go first. Maybe that person is you. Not because you're fearless, but because you're ready to stop carrying the weight of unspoken things. Because silence is heavy, and truth, even when it hurts, can set you free. And maybe, just maybe, someone else too.
When victims can't speak, abuse, shame, and coercion. Some silences are chosen, some are enforced, and some are carved into the soul of a person so deeply they forget there was ever a voice inside them. In the silence economy, perhaps the most heartbreaking silence is that of the victim. Not because they don't want to speak, but because they can't. Because something was stolen, not just from their body or their freedom, but from their ability to tell the world what happened. This is not about weakness, it's about survival. And when we judge the quiet, we forget the weight they carry just to exist. The aftermath no one sees. After the abuse ends, after the violence stops, after the manipulation is exposed, what comes next is often worse. The loneliness, the disbelief, the shame. Victims aren't always met with comfort. They're met with suspicion, with silence, with questions like, "Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you speak up sooner? Are you sure it happened that way?" So they retreat, not because they're unsure, but because the world made them feel like their pain was too inconvenient to be true. And so they stay quiet, for days, for years, sometimes forever. Silence as protection. For many victims, silence is not surrender, it's protection. Protection from retaliation, from humiliation, from a system that often punishes those who come forward. A victim reports their abuser, and suddenly their own past is on trial. Their photos, their texts, their choices. As if being harmed means they must now prove they are perfect to be believed. So they learn that speaking is dangerous, that truth is expensive, that healing is something they must do in the dark. And the abuser often walks free, not because the system failed, but because the system was never built to believe the wounded. Shame is louder than pain. One of the cruelest weapons used against victims is shame, not inflicted by fists, but by words, by silence,
by the looks of people who once loved them but now look away. Shame says, you should have known better. You should have fought harder. You should have been smarter. It turns trauma inward. It convinces victims they were complicit, that their pain is proof of weakness, not survival. And when shame takes root, it becomes the loudest voice in the room, louder than memory, louder than truth, louder than healing. And it says, stay silent. No one will understand. No one will stay. The power imbalance. In many cases, victims stay silent because they know the imbalance is too great. The person who hurt them has more money, more power, more connections, more credibility. The victim has nothing but their word. And in a world where power writes the narrative, one voice feels useless. If I speak, they'll destroy me. They'll sue me. They'll call me unstable. They'll say I'm doing it for attention. So they don't. Not because they're lying, but because they don't want to lose more than they already have. The threat is real. It's easy to ask, why don't victims just speak up? But that question assumes the world is safe. It isn't. Victims have been fired, evicted, publicly shamed, harassed, assaulted again after coming forward. Some have been stalked, threatened, killed. So no, the fear isn't imagined. It's real. It's logical. It's earned. In the silence economy, victims often pay the highest price for just trying to tell the truth. The failure of the justice system. Even when victims gather the strength to speak, to file charges, to testify, they're often met with another kind of silence. Closed cases, dismissals, lack of evidence, juries who don't believe them, judges who minimize, attorneys who question what they wore or why they waited so long. Justice, if it comes, is slow, and often it never comes at all. And so victims learn that telling the truth may not lead to justice, but only to more pain, and that staying quiet hurts less than fighting a system that was never designed for them. When silence is misunderstood, we look at people who stay silent and say, they must be hiding something. They must be lying. They must not be credible. But maybe they're just tired. Maybe they're afraid. Maybe they've tried before and no one listened. Silence isn't always a lie. Sometimes it's the only way a person knows how to survive. We shouldn't ask, why didn't they speak? We should ask, what did we do that made them feel they couldn't? The path to healing. Some victims eventually find their voice again, in therapy, in art, in writing, in whispered conversations with people who finally say, I believe you. That first moment of being heard, really heard, can begin to untangle years of internal silence. Because healing is not loud. It's fragile, private, messy, and moves at the pace of trust. The responsibility is on us. If we want to dismantle the silence economy, we must make it safer for victims to speak. That means believing them, protecting them, supporting them even when their stories are uncomfortable, even when their pain challenges our worldviews. Because silence is not just theirs, it is ours too, if we keep looking away. Truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it trembles. Sometimes it barely whispers. Sometimes it hides in the corner of a room, waiting for someone to turn toward it and listen. Are we willing to be that person? Are we willing to break the silence, not just for ourselves, but for those who never got the chance? Because in a world where victims are punished for speaking, being the one who listens is a revolutionary act.
Governments, surveillance, and institutional silence. There is a silence so large, it doesn't feel like silence at all. It feels like order, like patriotism, like obedience, like the natural way things are. But behind that calm, behind the rules and uniforms and flags, is a system that depends on your silence to survive. Governments are not exempt from the silence economy. They are often its architects. Not just through censorship, but through bureaucracy, through surveillance, through fear disguised as law, and control disguised as protection. The illusion of transparency. Most modern governments claim to be transparent. They publish press releases, hold briefings, issue reports. They say, "We have nothing to hide." But transparency is not about how much is said. It's about what is never allowed to be said. Behind the headlines, there are redacted documents, delayed disclosures, whistleblowers prosecuted, journalists monitored, questions unanswered. What is visible is carefully selected. What is hidden is often what matters most. This is not transparency. This is theater. The cost of speaking out against power. Throughout history, the greatest threat to any government has never been violence. It has been exposure. One person telling the truth about what's happening behind closed doors. And so, those who speak out are rarely rewarded. They are punished, silenced, discredited, labeled as traitors, leakers, foreign agents, or threats to national security. All for revealing what should never have been hidden in the first place. This is the institutional response to inconvenient truth. Crush it before it spreads. The weapon of surveillance. One of the most powerful tools of modern silence is surveillance. When you know you're being watched, you speak differently. You think twice. You self-censor, not because someone told you to, but because you feel exposed. This is how control is maintained without ever raising a weapon. Your phone, your emails, your camera, your social media, your location, all feeding into a system that listens more than it speaks. And the message is clear: we are watching. Not always to protect you, but to make sure you don't become a problem. The bureaucracy of silence. Sometimes silence doesn't come from threats, but from process. You try to report corruption. You're told to fill out a form. You send a complaint. It's lost in the system. You ask for answers. You're redirected. You file again. No reply. Eventually, you give up. This is bureaucratic silence. It wears you down. It delays until you disappear. It gives the appearance of openness while ensuring nothing ever changes. It is a silence built from waiting rooms, hotlines, form letters, and automated responses. And it's one of the most effective forms of suppression ever invented. Fear disguised as patriotism. One of the oldest tricks in the silence economy is to equate truth with betrayal. When someone exposes wrongdoing in government, they're not called brave, they're called ungrateful, unpatriotic, dangerous. The system wraps itself in the flag, so any criticism feels like an attack on the country rather than a call for justice. This creates a culture where speaking up feels like disloyalty, even when it's done to protect others. It makes silence feel noble, and truth feel like treason. This is how fear is moralized, how silence becomes a virtue, and how corruption stays hidden in plain sight. The institutional response to inconvenient truth: crush it before it spreads. The media as a gatekeeper. In many countries, the media is supposed to keep governments in check. But when the media is owned, controlled, or heavily influenced by the state, it becomes another arm of the silence machine. Stories are killed, sources are exposed, editors are pressured, journalists disappear. What's left is not news, but narrative, carefully shaped, closely managed, and deeply invested in preserving the illusion that nothing is wrong. And the public? They are kept just informed enough to stay passive, but never enough to take action. Silencing the people. Protest is the last voice of the unheard, but even that is met with silence, not by ignoring it, but by criminalizing it, by declaring it unlawful, by surrounding it with armed presence, by framing it as chaos, even when it is peaceful. The right to speak, to assemble, to dissent is slowly eroded by regulation, by intimidation, by surveillance, until it exists only in theory. And so, many stop before they even begin, because they know what it costs to speak. The myth of safety. The silence imposed by institutions is often justified as safety. We can't tell you, for your own protection. We're withholding information to prevent panic. We need to act in secrecy for national interest. But whose safety is really being protected? Because more often than not, what's being guarded is not the people, but the power. And silence is the currency used to maintain it. The role of the citizen. In a system like this, the silence is not just institutional, it's internalized. People learn to look away, to avoid asking questions, to stay apolitical, to focus on their own lives. And over time, the silence becomes normal, expected, invisible. But silence is never neutral. It protects the oppressor, not the oppressed. It maintains the lie, not the truth. It enables the abuse, not the justice. And every time we stay quiet, we participate in the very thing we fear. What breaks it? There are people who still speak, despite the surveillance, despite the threats, despite the pressure. They risk exile, imprisonment, ruin. But they speak because truth is not a luxury. It is a responsibility. They remind us that power only fears one thing, a population that sees clearly and refuses to stay silent. It begins with questions, with courage, with people who realize that silence, even when comfortable, is complicity. And the moment we choose to speak, to listen, to demand, we begin to dismantle the machine from the inside out. Because the silence economy can only survive if we let it. Everyday silence, when ordinary people learn to shut up. The silence economy isn't just something that happens in courtrooms, in governments, in boardrooms, or behind closed doors. It lives in the ordinary, in everyday life, in families, friendships, offices, schools, neighborhoods, even in the mirror. It survives not because of grand conspiracies, but because millions of ordinary people learn to shut up in the name of convenience, of politeness, of survival. This is the silence that doesn't make headlines, but it's the kind that holds everything else in place. When silence becomes social. You see something wrong, someone being mistreated, a racist comment, a sexist joke, a cruel policy, a silent injustice. And then you feel it, the tension, the pressure to not be the one who makes it awkward. So you stay quiet, you smile, you walk away, you rationalize it. Maybe it's not your business. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe it's better to just move on. And just like that, silence wins again. Not because you're evil, not because you agree, but because silence is easier than confrontation. And easier always wins until everything meaningful has been buried under it. The fear of being difficult. In daily life, there's a quiet war between truth and likability. We want to be accepted, to be liked, to be safe. And often, the truth gets in the way of that. So we learn to edit ourselves. At the dinner table, in meetings, on social media, in conversations with friends, in interactions with authority. We avoid speaking up because we don't want to be labeled as dramatic or negative or too intense or difficult. We learn to say less so we can stay in the room. And over time, we convince ourselves that silence is maturity, when in fact, it's just fear in a better outfit. The culture of don't ask, don't tell. In many homes, many workplaces, many cultures, there's an unspoken rule. Don't talk about that. Don't talk about mental illness. Don't talk about money. Don't talk about abuse. Don't talk about politics. Don't talk about that family member. Don't talk about what really happened. It's not written down. It's felt in the awkward glances, in the sudden silence, in the way people change the subject. And so we learn. We learn which truths are allowed and which must stay buried. We learn to survive by erasing parts of ourselves until what remains is acceptable but incomplete. The silence of survival. Some people stay silent because they have to, because they can't afford to lose a job, because they live in a place where speaking freely is dangerous, because they're undocumented, because they've already lost too much, because they're healing from trauma, because they're tired. This kind of silence is not consent, it is protection, and it deserves compassion, not judgment. But even this silence feeds the system that counts on people having too much to lose to ever speak. The workplace hush. In the office, the silence is often polished, dressed in HR language, tucked beneath performance reviews, coded in team culture. You learn quickly what not to say, which manager not to cross, which behavior to ignore, which truth is a career killer. You laugh at things you shouldn't. You nod along with things you hate. You bite your tongue until it bleeds professionalism. And when you get home, you wonder why you're so exhausted from doing nothing wrong. It's because every silence costs energy, especially the ones you force yourself to carry day after day. The silence between friends. Even in friendships, silence takes root. You notice a friend being toxic. You feel disrespected. You disagree deeply. You want to say something real, but you don't because you don't want to lose them, because you don't want the drama, because you're afraid they'll walk away. So instead, you stay quiet. You pretend. You shrink. Until one day you realize the friendship you're protecting is no longer real. It's just two people agreeing not to tell the truth. The generational silence. Many of us were raised in homes where silence was taught as strength. Don't cry. Don't complain. Don't question adults. Don't talk back. Don't ask why. Don't show weakness. We learned that being quiet meant being good, and being good meant being silent. So we grew up not knowing how to express hurt, not knowing how to ask for help, not knowing how to set boundaries. And now we raise children in the same systems, wondering why they don't talk to us. The everyday price. Every time we stay silent, something small dies. An opportunity for truth, a moment of connection, a boundary that needed setting, a wound that could have been addressed, a part of ourselves that wanted to be seen. And though no one punishes us directly, the punishment is real. It shows up in anxiety, in resentment, in loneliness, in the aching feeling that no one really knows us because we never gave them the chance. What honesty really takes. Honesty doesn't always require a microphone. Sometimes it starts with a whisper, with a quiet, "This isn't okay," with a calm, "I need to say something," with the courage to be uncomfortable for just a few moments, so you don't have to carry discomfort for the rest of your life. We are not meant to agree all the time. We are not meant to be silent. We are not meant to swallow every truth just to be liked. We are meant to speak, to grow, to tell the truth even when it shakes. Because the silence we keep in our daily lives feeds the bigger silence that allows injustice to thrive. And when we choose to speak in the small moments, we begin to reclaim the power that was always ours.
The cost of truth, and why most people can't afford it. We say we want the truth. We praise honesty. We applaud whistleblowers. We admire those who speak up. But deep down, we all know the truth has a price. And for most people, that price is simply too high. We don't talk about this enough. We act as if truth is free, as if anyone can speak it at any time, as if silence is cowardice and truth is just a matter of bravery. But the truth is expensive. It can cost you your job, your family, your reputation, your safety, your future, and your peace. And that's why so many choose silence. Not because they don't know what's right, but because they can't afford what it costs to say it out loud. Truth versus survival. Imagine you discover something deeply wrong at your workplace, your church, your school, your government, your home. You know what's happening isn't okay. You know someone needs to speak up, but you also know you have bills to pay, children to raise, a mortgage to cover, a degree to finish, a visa to maintain, a reputation you spent years building. And suddenly, truth becomes a threat, not to the system, but to you. Do you speak and risk losing everything? Or do you stay silent and try to live with yourself? For most, it's not even a real choice. It's a calculation, a painful one, and the numbers don't lie. Because when survival is on the line, truth often loses. The invisible toll. Even when people do choose to speak, the cost doesn't end with that moment. There's the backlash, the isolation, the legal threats, the media scrutiny, the financial fallout, the endless questions, the relationships that suddenly go cold, the friends who disappear, the exhaustion of having to relive your trauma over and over just to prove it happened. And sometimes the worst part isn't that people don't believe you. It's that they do, and still do nothing. That kind of silence, after the truth is spoken, is a second betrayal. Truth doesn't guarantee justice. One of the most dangerous myths in our culture is that if you tell the truth, justice will follow. That if you just speak up,
things will get better. The bad people will be punished. The system will correct itself. But too often, that doesn't happen. Truth tellers are left behind, exposed, discarded, and the system moves on, untouched. It rewards silence, not integrity. And so the message spreads louder than any verdict. Don't speak. It's not worth it. No one will protect you. You'll stand alone. This isn't cynicism. This is reality for millions of people who dared to believe that truth was enough. Truth doesn't pay the rent. There's something deeply unfair about how society treats truth. You can lose everything for doing the right thing and gain nothing but a clear conscience. You can be blacklisted from your industry while the people who caused harm get promotions. You can end up broke while the system you challenged becomes richer. There are no medals, no compensation, no guarantee of safety. Just you and your choice to live in alignment with your values while the world punishes you for it. That's the kind of integrity no one claps for. The silence of the poor. Truth, ironically, has become a luxury because the people who are safest to speak are the ones who can afford to. The wealthy, the connected, the powerful, the retired, the already famous. But for the single mother, the immigrant worker, the person on probation, the student on scholarship, the survivor living paycheck to paycheck, silence isn't weakness, it's protection. And no one should have to choose between telling the truth and feeding their children. But that's the choice millions are forced to make. Truth and the cost of belonging. Sometimes the cost isn't financial, it's emotional, relational, spiritual. When you speak the truth, you may lose your family, your church, your community, your sense of identity. The people you thought would stand beside you may turn against you. You're told you've changed, you're bitter, you're difficult, you're divisive. But the truth didn't make you bitter. The silence did, the denial did, the gaslighting did. And standing alone isn't bravery, it's heartbreak. That kind of cost few people are willing to pay, and no one should have to. The myth of consequence-free truth. We need to stop pretending that truth is always noble, always celebrated, always leads to justice. The truth can ruin you, and the system knows it, because that's why it invests more in punishing those who speak than in fixing what was spoken. Because it doesn't fear lies, it fears exposure. And so the cost of truth is kept deliberately high to discourage others from trying to afford it. But some pay it anyway. And yet there are those who still speak, knowing the risks, knowing the cost, knowing they might lose everything. They speak, not because they're stronger, but because they can't live with the weight of silence. Because what's more unbearable than the consequences is the compromise. What they lose externally, they gain internally. Peace, clarity, the ability to look in the mirror and say, I didn't stay silent. That kind of truth may not pay the bills, but it buys back your soul. Rewriting the equation. If we want more people to speak, we have to make truth less expensive. We have to build systems that protect truth tellers, not punish them. We need laws with teeth, support networks that show up, communities that listen, and workplaces that reward integrity. Because until the cost of silence becomes higher than the cost of truth,
Most people will keep their mouths shut, not because they don't care, but because they have no choice. And that's the real tragedy. When the economy of silence thrives, while the voices of the honest go broke.
Breaking the economy of silence. What speaking out really means. Speaking out. It sounds simple, like something anyone can do. Just say what happened. Just tell the truth. Just raise your voice. But when silence has been industrialized, when entire systems have been built to suppress, punish, and erase, speaking out becomes something else entirely. It becomes an act of defiance, of risk, of rebellion. And for many, it becomes the most courageous and costly decision they'll ever make. The fantasy versus the reality. We love the idea of truth-tellers. Movies portray them as heroes. Their courage wins in the end. They walk out of courtrooms triumphant. They expose corruption and change the world. But real life is messier. There's no soundtrack, no applause, no dramatic final scene. There's isolation, there's fear, there's fallout. And more often than not, the people who speak out don't walk away celebrated. They walk away alone. But they speak anyway, because something inside them refuses to cooperate with a lie. What speaking out actually means. It means risking your safety. It means becoming the story instead of just telling it. It means knowing that people will question your motives, dig into your past, call you bitter, angry, jealous, unstable, ungrateful. It means being told, this isn't the right time, this isn't the right place. You're making too much of this. You're going to ruin everything. It means nights without sleep, meals without appetite, weeks of anxiety, moments of wondering, was I wrong to do this? But you do it anyway, because the alternative is to live with a truth that's been suffocated inside you for far too long. It means choosing integrity over comfort, loneliness over complicity. It means understanding that speaking out doesn't always fix the system, but it stops the system from fixing you into someone you're not. The ripple effect. When one person speaks out, the system trembles just a little. Not because that one voice is loud enough to break it, but because it reminds others that they are not alone. And sometimes that's all it takes. One voice gives birth to 2, then 10, then 100. Movements are born from moments when someone refuses to stay silent, even when it would have been easier to turn away. That first crack becomes the opening for light to get in, and change always begins in the dark. The myth of being ready. People often wait for the perfect moment to speak, when they feel strong, when they have proof, when they think people will listen. But the truth is, you are never ready. You are only tired of being quiet. You speak when it's messy, when you're scared, when your hands shake, when your voice breaks, when your story still doesn't have an ending. And that's enough. Because the system doesn't need you to be perfect. It just needs you to stay quiet. And breaking that silence is enough. Speaking is not shouting. Breaking the silence doesn't always mean going viral. It doesn't always mean posting online or holding a press conference or writing a public letter. Sometimes it starts in private, in a therapist's office, in a conversation with a friend, in a journal, in a whispered sentence that says, "This happened, and it mattered." Truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be spoken. To someone, somewhere. That's how it begins. Truth is contagious. Silence spreads, but so does truth. Every time you speak it, you give someone else permission, not just to tell their story, but to believe it's worth telling. You show them that survival doesn't require erasure, that wounds don't disqualify you, that pain can become power if you give it air. And that power is what the silence economy fears most. When people stop apologizing for what happened to them, when they stop hiding, when they stop cooperating with their own silencing, that's when the system breaks. That's when the price of truth starts to fall and the cost of silence starts to rise. The truth doesn't always fix things. Sometimes speaking out won't change anything outside you. The system stays the same. The guilty go free. The public forgets. But it will change you. Because truth, even when ignored, frees something inside. It stops the bleeding. It lifts the shame. It tells the younger version of you that you didn't imagine it, that you weren't wrong, that you are no longer alone. That is not small. That is everything. You don't owe silence. You don't owe your silence to people who hurt you, to systems that failed you, to cultures that taught you to hide. You don't owe it to protect reputations or legacies or fragile egos. You don't owe it to keep the peace when the peace is built on your pain. You have the right to tell your story on your terms, at your pace, in your own voice. And when you do, you break the economy that profits from keeping you quiet. Speaking out is survival. At its core, speaking out is not about punishment. It's not about revenge. It's not about exposure. It's about survival. It's about reclaiming your voice after it was taken. It's about becoming visible after years of erasure. It's about choosing to heal out loud. And every time someone does that, they change the world. Just a little. Not with a scream, but with a sentence. I'm not staying silent anymore. The truth will cost you, but it will set others free. Every truth has a price, and the moment you decide to speak it, you begin paying. Not always in money, sometimes in relationships, in comfort, in certainty, in the life you had before the words left your mouth. You will lose things, sometimes people, sometimes opportunities, sometimes illusions that once kept you safe. But in that loss, something else begins. The freedom to stop pretending, the power to stop cooperating with your own silencing, the quiet dignity of knowing you chose truth even when it hurt. That freedom isn't just for you. It ripples outward, invisible but real. It reaches someone who's still quiet, still doubting, still wondering if their voice matters. And when they see you, standing where you are, scarred but not broken, they whisper to themselves, "Maybe I can speak too." And that is how the silence economy breaks. Not with revolutions, but with individuals choosing again and again to live in truth, no matter what it costs. Silence protects systems, but truth protects people. Silence keeps injustice intact, but truth gives others a way out. Silence keeps things comfortable, but truth cracks them open so light can get in. You may not feel heroic. You may feel scared. You may regret it some days. You may ache for the version of life you had before the truth came out. But someone out there is living in a lie because no one ever told them there was another way. Your truth might be their first glimpse of that way. We don't get to choose how others respond to our courage. We don't get to control what changes or how fast.
but we do get to decide whether we will contribute to the silence or break it. We get to decide whether we will carry the weight of truth alone or release it into the world, where it might become something more than just our story. It might become someone else's survival, someone else's healing, someone else's turning point. The truth will cost you. That's not a myth, it's reality. But silence costs more. It costs your integrity, your clarity, your peace, your ability to look in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. And in the long run, what matters most is not whether you kept things together, but whether you were true to what you knew, deep in your bones. So speak, even if your voice shakes, even if your story is messy, even if no one claps. Speak because your words matter, even if they only set one person free. Speak because someone once needed to hear what you are brave enough to say. And speak because silence is not where healing lives. The silence economy has had its time. Now it's your turn. Let the truth be heard.